Good morning. For the past year, I have been doing Zoom sermons every week for the two churches that I serve, First Christian Church in Holton and the Topeka Church of the Brethren here in Topeka, Kansas. This morning, I'm happy to say that the Emporia First Christian Church is joining us for these Zoom sermons. And I greet you and I welcome you, and I look forward to sharing with you the great good news of the gospel. I've been doing a series of sermons on the Lord's Prayer over the past, ever since the beginning of Epiphany. And I've taken each phrase separately. And so this morning, we're looking at the line in the Lord's Prayer where Jesus said, "Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil." And as I had reflected on that phrase out of his prayer, the scripture that came to my mind was the time when he was tested for 40 days in the wilderness, right after he was baptized by John the Baptist. This is found in the 4th chapter of Matthew's Gospel, beginning with the first and reading through the 11th verses. Hear now the reading of the scripture. Then Jesus was led by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. After fasting for 40 days and 40 nights, he was hungry, and the tempter came to him and said, "If you're the Son of God, tell these stones to become bread." Jesus answered, "It is written, man shall not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of God." And then the devil took him to a holy city and had him stand on the highest point of the temple. And he said, "If you're the Son of God, throw yourself down, for it's written, he will command the angels concerning you, and they'll lift you up in their hands, so that you will not strike your foot against a stone." Jesus answered and said, "It's also written, do not put the Lord your God to the test." Again, the devil took him to a very high mountain and showed him all of the kingdoms of the world and their splendor. "All of this," he said, "I will give to you if you'll just bow down and worship me." And Jesus said to him, "Away from you, Satan, for it is written, worship the Lord your God and serve him only." And then the devil left him, and the angels came, and they attended to him. Thus ends the reading of the word. As I said, during the season of Lent, these 40 days leading up to the celebration of the resurrection on Easter Day, I have been reflecting on each one of the phrases of this prayer, the model prayer that Jesus gives us. It's a part of his Sermon on the Mount, recorded in the 6th chapter of Matthew. We've reflected on the way Jesus addressed God, what Jesus meant by saying, "Thy kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven," and what he meant when he prayed, "Give us today our daily bread, one day at a time, sweet Jesus." This morning, I invite you to think with me about that phrase that we repeat every Sunday morning, most of us. Every time we join together in prayer, we say, "Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil." So the scripture from Matthew's Gospel, it is a reminder to us that Jesus knew everything there was to know about temptation. In fact, the gospel narratives are consistent in telling the story of Jesus' 40-day wilderness temptation experience. It's told in each one of the synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And each of the accounts we read that after he was baptized by John the Baptist, he was led by the Spirit. Think about that for a moment. Led by the Spirit into the wilderness where he experienced temptation. From the baptistry river to the wilderness of temptation, all in one quick step. with hardly an intervention, with hardly the blinking of an eye. From a spiritual high, where God's voice is ever so clear, to the wilderness, where it seems that the power of evil, without question, is the dominating force. I've been in the wilderness with Jesus this week. All week long, I've been thinking of Jesus in the wilderness. I always begin my sermon preparation on Mondays, reading through the scripture, picking out maybe a specific word that I want to get unpacked. And this week, that word was wilderness. I've been thinking about what a powerful image is wilderness in both the Old and the New Testament. And sometimes it's a negative, sometimes it's a positive. The wilderness is where Abraham deposited Hagar and Ishmael. You remember that story. Hagar, his wife's Egyptian slave, whom she no longer needed, since Sarah had, in her 90s, mind you, become pregnant with the baby boy they would name Isaac. So wilderness became a dumping ground for a no longer needed slave. Wilderness has been seen as dark and dangerous, a place of solitary confinement for Hagar and her son. But it was also into a wilderness that Moses led the Hebrew slaves. They were people, they'd all become slaves. In Egypt, they were seeking a land of promise. And God led them through the wilderness to get there. For 40 years, through wilderness, and it was challenging for these people. And yet, it was a pathway to freedom, a roadway to promise, a place of emancipation. The prophet Isaiah speaks of wilderness in his message to the people he was addressing. He speaks of the wilderness as a place where there'll be a voice crying out, "Make way for the Lord in the wilderness." And then John the Baptist comes along and cries out those same words from Isaiah as a fulfillment of Isaiah's prophecy. He says, "Make smooth the desert, in the desert, wilderness, a highway for our God. Let every valley be filled up and every mountain and hill be made low. Let the rough ground become a plain and the rugged terrain a broad valley." So wilderness is all the way through the scripture, good and bad. So what does that image do for you? That's the real point here this morning. What does it do for contemporary disciples of Jesus? I don't know about you, but when I listen to the news day in and day out of what's going on in this country of ours, the confusion, our legislators working all night long to pass legislation, so much division, so much confusion. And most of us are sitting on the sidelines saying, "Come on, let's get your act together." Our country is so divided, it feels like a wilderness. Sometimes my days feel like a wilderness. When I have to contemplate or when I have to deal with struggles that I really didn't invite into my life. And when I do, I think about Jesus, led by the Spirit, mind you, led by the Spirit into the wilderness, from the baptistry river to the wilderness of temptation, all in one quick, easy step. And I say, how like that life is. That's reality for most of us. Just when you think you've got things pretty well whipped into shape, just when you think you have that habit conquered, just when you think you've reached a new height of maturity, just when you've gotten to the point of saying, I forgive you, or when you really have been washed in the Jordan, then comes the encounter with the evil one. We enter the wilderness. We meet the tempter head on. How like that life is. For all of us, I think. Even for Jesus himself. So Jesus taught us to pray, saying, lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. That phrase makes me think that even though Jesus said, don't lead us into temptation, maybe he thought we could handle that all by ourselves. Because he follows it up by saying, deliver us from evil. Don't lead us into temptation, but, oh, by the way, deliver us from evil. Good Lord, deliver us. You know, when Jesus teaches this prayer, he's teaching out of his real life experience. He had been to the desert. He knew wilderness. In fact, he had been led there by the Spirit. And you ever noticed how it is that the best teachers in the world are people who have had experience with whatever it is they're trying to teach? The best teachers in the world are people who've faced challenges, people who've undergone tests. The best teachers to help us understand the wilderness are the people who've been to the wilderness. The best people to help us understand the positive and the negative aspects of the wilderness are the people who've been there. And my guess is you, and you, and you, all of you, and me, we've all been there. You've been there. You've been to the wilderness. If you've been tempted to take the shortcut. You've been to the wilderness. If your boss came to you at any time and said, sorry, we don't have any need of you anymore. Temptations. You've been to the wilderness. If you've lost a parent, or if you've lost a loved one, if you've lost a spouse, if you've lost a child, God forbid. Isn't it easy to give up? Isn't it easy just to face the temptation and check out? We've been tempted to quit. But if you turn to this passage in Matthew's Gospel, you'll hear the words of one who's been to the wilderness. And because he has been there, he can speak and teach out of experience. And Jesus said, when you pray, say this: lead us not into temptation. But in case, by chance, we are really tempted and we succumb, deliver us from evil. When I was the ripe old age of 18, my parents delivered me one Sunday afternoon to the wilderness. I was deposited that day on the campus of one of our Disciples of Christ colleges, Culver Stockton. I spent the next 4 years of my life there. But to be honest, when I first arrived, it felt like wilderness to me. I didn't know anyone except my roommate. He was a good friend and a classmate from high school, and who had also chosen Culver to continue his education. But what seemed like a perfectly wonderful idea when I was at home during my senior year in high school turned out to be a wilderness experience for me, filled with challenge, anxiety. I found myself yearning for home. This is too tough. This is too difficult. I found myself wishing I could get back to a safe place where I knew the territory. You know what I'm talking about. You've been there. You've stepped beyond your comfort zone. And a part of us always longs to be back in a sheltered domain One of the first things I discovered in this new territory was that there's no one to knock on my bedroom door and say, "Get up, it's time to go to school." There is no one to push me toward getting to class. And in fact, my roommate took advantage of the opportunity, and while most everyone else was listening to lectures and going over class notes and preparing for tests, accepting the challenges of the classroom in this new wilderness, my roommate was spending every day sharpening his skill and shooting pool and watching TV in the recreation room down the hall. My friend lavished in his newfound freedom in the wilderness. I, on the other hand, found myself seriously challenged. Challenges aren't a bad thing. I ended up 4 years graduating with honors, with my Bachelor of Science degree, the first in my immediate family to accomplish that goal. What I want to say to you this morning is that wilderness is real, and Jesus knew what he was talking about. When he said, "Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil," he was referencing back to a time when he had experienced just that. As I said, it's a dynamic I see being played out every time I pick up the newspaper, or when I listen to the news of the neighborhood and the world. It's a wilderness out there. And people abuse power that's been handed to them as elected leaders. People have inflicted wounds, serious wounds. This pandemic has been a challenge. People have been seriously wounded. Over 500,000 people have died, leaving empty places and families all over our country, all over the globe, all over the world. People have experienced woundedness. What do we do about the wilderness? Jesus said, when you pray, don't pray like the hypocrites do. They like to stand on the street corner so that they can be seen by others. But he said, go into your closet and pray like this. And that phrase was, lead us not into temptation. Deliver us from evil. The Other Side magazine not long ago carried a story that I think I'll never forget. The story of Doug Davidson, who took his 3-year-old son one day to the seminary library to return a book for a friend. He said, when my son Elliot and I stepped through the bright red doors into the darkened vestibule, there hung a sculpted crucifix, life-size, 5 feet tall. Jesus hanging there. Doug Davidson said, I watched his young eyes study Jesus, my 3-year-old. I watched him look at his agonized face, the dying body nailed to a tree, nails piercing his hands and his feet. I knew the image was a hard one for Elliot. We go to a Baptist church, said Doug. We don't have life-size caricatures of Jesus on the cross. And for a moment, I considered hustling my son back out the door, but it was too late. He had already taken it all in. I thought that Elliot might cry. Instead, without taking his eyes off of the dying Jesus, Elliot looked up to me and he said to me, "What happened? What happened?" I mumbled back something like this to Elliot. That really is a good question. Elliot, that's a good question. In this Lenten season, Elliot's question haunts me as well. It seems to me to be the perfect question when confronted with the cross. What happened to this gentle storyteller, full of God's compassion, who would so threaten the powers that they would have him tortured and killed? What happened that God's own incarnation in the midst of our world would be met with violence and pain and torture and murder. What happened? Doug Davidson said, most of the time I just walked by that crucifix without it really affecting me. But that day, my 3-year-old asked a question that haunted me. What happened? As we continue, my friends, through this season of Lent, I pray that each of us can look deeply within ourselves. And when we do that, we can see the possibilities for love and hate, for faithfulness and abandonment, for loyalty, for compromise, for accepting the challenge of the wilderness, and for falling short of our call from God's purpose in our lives. When you pray, don't stand on the street corners to be seen by men and women. Go into your closet and pray. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. That's how the master teacher taught us to pray. And he knew what he was talking about, for he had been to the wilderness.